Welcome. Hugely lovely to see the second event of the Arte Útil and the Room of Controversies, a name that needs no explaining, I guess. But it's a very important space in our project of the Museum of Arte Útil. We've been thinking about this project, we've been working on it for a long time. There's a certain theatricality that I guess you can see with this massive wall and the way in which we've articulated a kind of archive and a thought around what this movement might be in the Museum of Arte Útil and the practices that are considered utile or useful or important. This room is the room actually that's most close to our heart on that level in terms of what is brutalizing about a museum when it says there's a movement and making something visible. Whenever you show something, you leave something out. Whenever you say this is the thing, then you miss all the complexity of other things. And everybody actually in this discussion are in our archive, but what we realize is that the way in which we sort of try to name a conversation means that the complexity of what we're trying to talk about needs a space for discussion. And that's what this Room of Controversy is all about, the opportunity to really pull out with the experts, the people we admire most in the field, who might tell us more about what they think of our project, what they think of these criteria, but also how they articulate their practice in the most kind of clear way in terms of what we thought the criteria might explain about what art needs to do right now in the world. And so the first controversy or conversation that we had was around the notion of art and activism and sincerity, which probably, you know, if you're an activist or if you're an artist who deal with these things very apart from each other, make no sense. But when you're thinking about this idea of Arte Útil and the criteria that are in room 3, which say that these have to have a real and beneficial use in society, then you think, well, what is the role of symbolism or the role of just letting people know stuff or provoking things? And how does art relate to that? And so that was a really interesting conversation, which is now projected there around this idea of activism, which means so much because it's real, it's about people's lives, it's about doing something. And the realm of art, which often is about a kind of illumination and a symbolism and a metaphor. So how do you deal with the clashing elements of the need for something to actually happen and the notion of its metaphor? And the second sort of question that kept coming up when we talked about Arte Útil or the notion of this kind of practice is, well, you sound like you're just classically neoliberal. You sound like you're fulfilling all of what society wants right now, which is to do with being effective. Artists should be effective. They should be economically effective. They should solve problems. They should just fill the gaps. And at the most cynical, many governments in many situations have actually agreed with this. They've allowed artists to fill the gaps that actually maybe really governmentally should be happening anyway. And artists, of course, are super aware of this. And it's like, how do you deal with this idea of being instrumentalized when actually what you're trying to do is engage with society in a very real and very sincere way? And one of the classic examples that keeps coming up on many levels and probably has emerged most clearly in the last 20 years is the notion of gentrification. And many people tonight hopefully will talk about this idea of where they've maybe taken over space. We have space hijack here, we have institutional repurpose, we have many artists making gestures towards outside of the museum impacting in the real world. But when is this a process that has been sort of used into what we would call gentrification, where artists have actually been the first people to go into a space, and then it makes the space more attractive, it generates income, it sort of gets taken over by a whole other process. And where is the essential act of what the artists will do in the first place out of their control? So this idea of misuse, gentrification, misuse, the process of actually trying to transform society, it being misused by processes above us, or by ourselves, or us knowing that this might happen. These are the questions that constantly came up when we talked about artists who don't work just in the white cube of the museum, but actually out in real space, in real time, with all of the economic factors, with all of the social factors that we know in the 21st century are simply present. So tonight is the night where we get to talk this through in great detail with people who think about this very seriously on many levels. I could talk to Liesbeth Bikvanderro, who are the artists who are called Bikvanderro, who talk very, very seriously and interestingly about their role and how Rotterdam educated them, and they educated Rotterdam maybe, and how it influenced their situation, but how they thought about space and the development of the city. We talk about Renzo Martens, who's done an extraordinary project in the Congo, but actually literally uses the term gentrification as part and parcel of how he understands the mechanisms and the leverage that art might give right now. We talk about WochenKlausur, who we're delighted to have also here, who are here on residency, who are trying to think about this city, but have constantly gone into a city and tried to think, what is it that we can do in this city in the most creative and artistic way, but also in a very real way. And I would be delighted to hear again from them what it would mean to think about a term of gentrification and misuse. Teaster Gates, who we hope will come on Skype soon, a classic person who's really dealt very specifically and maybe surfed the border, maybe like Renzo in different ways, of gentrification, trying to think about its value, what its leverage is, in terms of thinking about practice, creativity, artistic value, and the community, and the real estate, and the place. And so, I'm just really excited and delighted that you're all here, and that we can have this discussion. I guess we're going to ask everybody to present for about 10 minutes, and then we should really debate these terms, gentrification, art útil, and misuse. And I'd like to hand over to Nick, who's also my fellow curator, along with Gemma and Alessandra and Job and Tanya and many other people. This show has been a very dynamic moment of lots of people sort of thinking these things through, but I would say it's been articulated very much through Gemma and Alessandra and Nick in terms of what are the issues that we want to talk about right now, and this is a key one, I think. And I think Nick could tell us a bit more about
I think you said it all.
You don't do that.
No, I think maybe it's interesting to think really quite specifically about the term gentrification and what we understand by that term. I mean, it's a term that was introduced in the 60s, and it was really a term that sort of was used to define the displacement of one community, a working class community, from a middle class community. So I think when we talk about art practice and gentrification, it's really this idea of displacing communities in its kind of sort of historical understanding of the term. You can flip that around perhaps and say, can we understand it through the formation of communities, and to put a sort of more positive spin on it. So how can art practice either displace or form communities, I think is a really interesting sort of line of inquiry. And also sort of quite specifically, and I'm sure this will come up within a number of projects, what are the relationships between artists, money and power, to be quite specific. And who has agency in these relationships? How are they being used, who's using or misusing who? So I hope these are kind of some of the areas that we can touch on. And just here to reiterate Annie's point, to say thank you very much for being here, particularly Renzo, Jos, Liesbeth, and WochenKlausur, and Theaster if he turns up, and everyone. It's great to have you here. So maybe who would like to go? Yeah?
Put something today? because we have both of these. Yeah. Okay, let's just do this.
What is in Spanish? Yeah, what would you like to answer?
No, it's okay.
It's okay.
If I can just
Oh, yeah. So you have to put this one off.
So let's just talk about yeah. So we have been discussing a little bit with Nick and also with Alessandra, and we decided together that we would talk about Rotterdam and where our practice sort of originates, or maybe started. I don't know if originates is the good word. It's actually the place where we met at art school, so it's an origination in that sense, somehow. And I would say that the city, but mostly I would say what the city generated for our practice has been very crucial for what we are doing today and how we are doing it in different other places than only Rotterdam, of course. Maybe just to run through the little history a little bit, and probably it's familiar for many of you because all these things are not very special, they also happen in other places. The only specificity I would say of Rotterdam is actually that I think that Rotterdam is not gentrifiable somehow. Everything seems to fail. Bulletproof, and I think the city is maybe you disagree, but I think that the city council is perhaps the one that is sort of actually continuously resisting gentrification, despite the fact that they would like to, or that they love to have it actually, you know, because they are the ones that really want to form the city and do, sort of go with the whole big movement of what big cities are. So this is an image that we use for a publication that I will show you at the end, and that you can also download from our website in Dutch, but we also have it in English, so we will put it up and then you can also have it in English if you are interested. So this is 3 towers in the city of Rotterdam. It's on the Marconiplein, and this is, I would say, really a really interesting illustration how the city is operating as a top-down organization. The city is the boss, the city council is the boss, and they sort of rule the city spatially, I would say. So they decide about what should be there, what should be where, etc. And that really comes, I would say, from the bombardment after the Second World War, or before the Second World War, because they were the ones who reconstructed the city and sort of took the opportunity to sort of totally redefine its infrastructure from then. And I would say that continued until today, but certainly until the moment that we arrived in that city, which was in the 80s. So this image is the 3 towers on the Marconiplein, and the Marconiplein is the different services of the city came here in the 70s. So that city renewal, what else? All these kind of infrastructural services, diensten, as you say, departments of the city arrived here. But they didn't arrive from nothing in this building, because before these departments were in the center of the city, just behind City Hall, in a building that they call Stadstimmerhuis. And the Stadstimmerhuis was the first building that was being let's say, the official governmental building that was built in the reconstruction period, so I would say in the 50s, early 50s. And from that headquarters, they sort of ruled the city. They sort of, reorganized the city and built everything from scratch, basically, in the beginning. So that's Stadstimmerhuis. At some point, the city got the idea that a big city needs big buildings, that sort of prove how big they are somehow, So they put these 3 buildings near the harbor, actually a little bit at the edge of the city, in the harbor, where now Kunst and Complex is, one of the largest initiatives in Rotterdam. And to be able to fill these office buildings. They wanted to build them, but they didn't think about renters. So it was empty for 3 years. And I think emptiness is one of the specificities of Rotterdam, I would say. So they solved that emptiness by transferring the departments that were in the city center to these buildings. And they have been there until now. Then, as you may know, recently the Rotterdam has been opened. I think I have an image. This is the buildings that I just showed. And this is the building, or actually this is not the building, but it's an image of the building because this is an image mock-up from the architect. So not the real one, but the real one is now being seen in full glory, you could say. So it opened a couple of weeks ago, or a month ago or something, and it's designed by Renzo Martens owner, yeah? And then again, to be able to actually even start thinking about building this building, they needed the guarantee, the project developers needed to guarantee that the building would actually be filled, be rented. Eh? But there was no security of what the city could give as who would rent those buildings. So what they did, they transferred again the departments of their own services, you know, from the 3 buildings that I showed before to these buildings here, which means that the 3 buildings that I showed before will be empty, you know. So it's this kind of continuous, and by the way, Renzo is also refurbishing, reconstructing the Stadstimmerhuis, which is in the city center, for more offices. So it's this kind of, you know, I would say rolling, continuous thing happening, yeah, in this city. So this is again a mock-up view.
Maybe it's interesting to say that Rotterdam is the only one who didn't build gas.
Yeah.
Despite in the whole.
And it's, I like the building.
Didn't build less. The other
They didn't slow down.
Didn't slow down.
So then, this is an image. I also had to think twice what this was, this image, because we made a presentation for another occasion a year ago or something. But this image is, the dots on this image is artist initiatives, artist-run buildings in the city of Rotterdam. And most of the artist-run buildings and that's where maybe our story in Rotterdam also starts. In the 80s, we went to the art school there. There was nothing, so you either stay or you go. If you stay, you make something of it. That's basically the idea. And many other artists with us also decided that they wanted to stay. And since there was, at that time, I wouldn't again call it a gentrification, but there's, let's say, schools that were moving out of the old school buildings and they had to move to new buildings that were built. And then areas with other smaller industrial buildings, also the industry left because they went out of the city and these buildings were empty and there were no other people or organizations that would rent it. So at that time and still today I would say that squatting, for example, is not so much a thing that happened in Rotterdam. You know, you just negotiate with the officials, let's say, the owner, usually the city itself, and you usually got the key. And then you have this kind of, you know, op-ot contract, as they call it, a contract that is usually for 2 weeks or maybe 2 months or something, and then when you need it, you have to go. So the first building that we were in, which was like somewhere here, we were there for 10 years, and then the other building that we were in, which is here, somewhere, here actually, we were there again for more than 10 years. 20 years, yeah. Shit. And we just left it because the city wanted it back for, again, to sort of redo it and to open it up for a school.
Maybe it's also to say when we came, the school left, so we moved in. It's quite big, it's 4,000 square meters, so it was hosting 50 artists. So we also negotiated in the beginning because they wanted to tear it down, but we knew there was, you could say, gentrification taking place in 15 years in that area, because it's a very popular area around this lake, you can see it. And what they did in the meantime, like 4 or 5 years ago, they tear down all the social housing in this neighborhood away. So So they all disappeared. We knew that it would happen, and so we negotiated a contract for 15 years. So that at that time, which is now, we knew we had to leave. The cynical thing is, the building now is empty, but due to the crisis, they don't have an architect, there's no construction, there's one. They have 10.5 million euros to renovate or whatever. But all the contractors say, well, we can't do it for that amount of money. So we had to leave the building. The building is already empty. It's falling apart more or less. And it's happening more and more. So they evict artists from former school buildings. And you know, the market it's not profitable, the renting market. So they can, so they are evicting artists from studios. They don't have any plan what to do with it. So it's more vacancy, it's happening more.
No. But maybe, yeah, I don't know if I have so much more images. No, not really. Maybe, well, it's a nice image of the architects Rietveld, who were in the Venice Pavilion 3-4 years ago, something like that, with the architectural biennial. And they investigated all the state-owned buildings that were empty in the Netherlands. And they remade them as a model, and they made a big atlas that sort of brings all these buildings together. And they are everywhere, you know, from Groningen to Limburg, from Amsterdam to Rotterdam, everywhere, you know. And so this is the whole collection, let's say, of vacant buildings in the Netherlands that they state-owned, so public buildings, not private buildings. So I think that's interesting. Maybe a little bit about how that formed our practice, I would say, maybe a little bit. Because when we were going through the whole process of these two buildings and forming an artist initiative, let's say, to create a cultural climate in the city that did not have it at the time when we arrived. So when we started in that first building, I would say in more or less the same time, 5, 6, 7 other artist groups also started in different locations, and that sort of grew. And one of the things that I think was very specific in all these artist organizations is that they all started also with residency spaces, because nobody actually had the intention. There were not so many people coming to Rotterdam because there was not so much, let's say, to see. And also there was not so much there were not many platforms to perform or to do things. So all these buildings sort of started this residency program in order to get people to the city. They all started exhibition programs, you know, loosely, like very loose, I would say. And then at some point, I would say in the early 90s, that it created a sort of turning point. So actually at that time, I would say that it started to happen that more and more people came to Rotterdam. And that's not only because of the artist initiatives, of course, but it was also the time when the city was sort of finished building or rebuilding the city center and the housing situation and the school situation and so on. And actually it was also the moment that in the early 90s, the city decided, okay, now we have done everything that's needed, now we start with culture. So that's when they started investing also in museums. They built the Architecture Museum, the Kunsthal. They decided about the Cultural X. It was the start of it, Tent, and all these other cultural, contemporary art centers. And so the 90s, I think, showed a really energetic 10 years, I would say, until 2001, which was the cultural capital, and then everything was sort of totally, I think we can also talk about that as a gentrification meme, or maybe a counter-gentrification meme, I don't know. Because that generated so much energy and so much money that after that it totally fell apart, I would say. And that was also the turn on, and then we can go into the politics and so on, because it was also turning over from socialist city. The PvdA, the socialist was always after the Second World War in charge. And then after 2002, when Pim came up and got killed, it was totally changed. And still, I would say today, in a little bit of a turmoil somehow. But I think what is really important, and that's why I'm really thinking like, okay, gentrification, what is it? Displacing communities, yes. And like what Jos was saying, in the area where we had the last building, communities were displaced, not because of the artists, but because of the city wanted to change that area into something really nice, nice houses and so on. So they built half, they ran out of money, there were not many buyers, and now it's basically a desert somehow, So it's partly succeeded and it's partly empty. And then I mean empty land,
Yeah.
Wasteland. So I think in that sense I would say that Rotterdam is not so easy to gentrify, also because they change the policy every 5 years, so they have no way of seeing, let's say, beyond their own horizon, which is the next 4 years.
Well, thank you. I think this is really, thank you for the presentation, but also in the sense of what it was to start out and think about it, and what you wanted to do, and then also, just these are questions I guess that go in our minds until we have a chance to really talk it through together. That idea of knowing what you know now, about how that aspiration to do that and knowledge of the city, and its sense of using you or not using you or you using them, is I think a really interesting thing right now, probably very different than the knowledge we had 20 years ago, or not, I don't know. And it's quite interesting to hear about the unidentifiable space. Yes. But also that idea of like, what is the idea of when the government says that this can happen and you kind of know it, and when you decide that you want to act against it or work with it, or all those things that are really questions for so it's really, really great. I think we're going to try and get the Theaster on for 15 minutes.
No facial expression to give me at all.
Right.
And
Hello? Amsterdam calling. Or not Amsterdam, Vanabbe,
Hello.
Hello, Theaster?
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
That's okay, there's a lot of us. Let's see.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, the camera's on, so hopefully.
Yeah. I take a minute or two. Maybe while I'm waiting for the image to appear or not, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us, Theaster.
My pleasure.
We're with a group of about, 25, 30 people. Hi. And we're and everybody else. Can you see us? We can see you now.
It's great to hear you all.
Good. Well, the lovely thing about being part of this and part of our show is that we know you. You've been part of the vanabbe history, which is kind of lovely to talk to you again. How's it going, Theaster? How are we doing? Where are you taking us?
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you okay. Can you hear us?
I hear you just fine.
Okay.
It be that we're not able to I may not be able to have video contact.
Okay, if you don't mind, we can see you in all your glory, so it's lovely.
Okay.
I know if you can see us, but not to worry, we'll do our best. There's about 25, 30 of us sitting here in the Vanabbe Museum talking about Arte Útil and talking about gentrification. So it's just fabulous to have this moment to talk to you. We just had our first presentation from artists from idea of art that's useful and it's a tool, it's transformative, it's imaginative, it's somehow maybe even pushing the status quo. And the danger, of course, that we constantly come up against is, are we being instrumentalized by government, by powers that be, by real estate? How do we think about our practices in relation to these things? And of course,
Yes.
you can resist.
I understand. That is the question.
Yeah.
Would you like me to respond to that?
I would love you to respond to that.
So, I'd like to imagine that we are not innocent people in our engagement with the city. But sometimes we're not always the most informed. So, sometimes when an opportunity is given to us, like, hey artist, you should come and occupy my space for the next 2 years, when we say yes to these kinds of opportunities, we're often kind of setting ourselves up to have a great experience temporarily, but have no real stake in the overall kind of future of the place. And so one way that I'm just thinking about this idea is, how can artists be much more thoughtful in why we engage space? And then what are the terms that we need to abide by in order to like some degree in our engagement? The reality is, we want to put our stuff in the world, but I think the challenge is that sometimes we incidentally become used and leveraged by entities that we don't really believe in because we want so badly an opportunity.
That makes complete sense. I mean, this is the point of, awareness and knowledge. And so how have you sort of chosen to think about these forces and elements in relation to your practice?
Well, like say with Dorchester projects, by the time that I realized that maybe I was going to be here for a long time and that I was going to invest in my building to try to make it as beautiful as possible, I knew that eventually other people might want to speculate around these buildings and speculate the value because I was creating value. And so I was very intentional myself and with friends and with my neighbors to try to say, look, you guys, if we keep working on these buildings, other people are going to want to buy them and they're going to want to move here. Let's move in advance of the gentrifying forces to try to take ownership of the space that we have around us, either political ownership or like cultural ownership, like working with our local political officials to make sure that before certain buildings are sold that we know about them, if they're available, and that we can kind of hold developers accountable for the kind of development that they want to do. Because in my neighborhood, we need development to happen. There are too many buildings, but we want it to happen with sensitivity to the people who are already here. It's meant that to almost learn the language of development in order to be thoughtfully engaged in the conversation of redevelopment and the possibility of gentrification.
No, it's super interesting to hear. I guess there's another element, and how has that worked? I mean, I guess it's not easy to say it has an immediate effect. I guess it's a long-term project, but do you feel like that's kind of happening?
Well, one thing that's really important to remember is that not all of our cities are the same.
Yeah, exactly.
That redevelopment that's happening and the redevelopment that's happening in New York or London or Paris is different from, say, Chicago, where there's tremendous amount of land that are not in the city center. And so things kind of redevelopment that's happening, it happens much more slowly here. And so I think that the artist's response to our different cities, it requires that we have a very clear sense of the context of it. Like how long before a certain kind of gentrification and redevelopment happens? How much money is the city putting into these redevelopments to expedite the activity? What are the NGO and not-for-profit organizations that can act as partners that help folks who are local to a place remain part of that place as it redevelops? And so there are just a lot of questions that I think we as artists who represent a kind of sector of the city, we should much more, we should large place people not safe.
We're losing you.
Okay.
There I am.
There you are. No, good. I mean, it's interesting because the previous presentation just talked about how, indeed, I kind of get this idea of slowness and different cities are different. We just talked about how Rotterdam, according to Liesbeth Bikvanderro, is ungentrifiable in a way. So it's really important to kind of think about these things. I'm asking you questions right now, but I'd love and want to make available the possibility, if you don't mind, that other people can ask something. But I have one more key question around this notion, which is one of the things I find super fascinating about how you've worked when you're located in the community is how you feedback a kind of process that's there with a kind of dissemination in the art world. So is there a way in which, and I mean literally gallerists, sort of museums at that moment, how do you locate the two in terms of economy?
Right. Well, I mean, I feel like in many ways that question is summing up the artistic practice overall that I've been engaged in. The reality is, when I started making work, there were no venues to receive the work, so I had to create the venue. There was no interest in a certain kind of live activity, so I had to identify new audiences that were interested in the things that I was playing. There was no market, financial market, for the things that I produced, so I gave them away. And there was like a kind of initially, there was the only way to be involved in the conversation of art was to invent new systems altogether for my engagement. At some point, when the art world was interested in the topic, space had become my principal subject, and thinking a lot about, spaces like the one I live in Dorchester. And then the market, like nothing had really changed in that I had always used all of the money that I had to do the things that I really believe in. And so when there was more opportunities to share these objects in the world, which I feel great about, it also meant that there was more opportunity to be more impactful. And when I say impactful, it was really like, I have a building fetish. I like seeing buildings restored. It wasn't that I was attempting to be nice or a certain kind of generous, but I understood that the work was having an impact on the built environment. And that felt like an extension of the practice. My hope is that artists deserve value and deserve recognition and deserve opportunity for the things that we put in the world. I've been an artist for 20 years, and it's only been the last 3 or 4 years that there's been interest in the work. But for those other 17 years, I felt like the work was equally important, and I was as diligent about making it, you know. And so I think that whether the art world loves the work or not, it was just super important to me to continue to try to create new forms.
Right.
But I think that there's a particular interest in the relationship between these little things like the objects and the big things like the buildings, because I think that the art world is actually asking itself questions about what's important. And I think that objects are important, but I also think that there's this kind of curiosity, fascination, interest in, desire for deeper relationships with other people. A sense that the work people buy and the work that we collect in museums, that work has intrinsic and extrinsic value. That there's a work with this value because of the work itself, but sometimes it is also a signifier for other things. And again, in a way that I could have predicted a phenomenon of some sort or that people would like to work, I'm just really trying to make the connections that I think are important. And so there is a relationship between these objects I make and the things that they signify. It may not always be written on the shoulder of the work, but it's there. And there are a lot of moments that are not about the market, that are simply happening, and I actually think that many of those are the magical moments for me in my practice. It's the stuff.
We lost you for a second. Can you hear us?
I can't. Can you hear me?
Okay. No, great. I have 2 questions. One is, I don't want to put you in a position where you have to stay online in a weird way, but it would be lovely if you could participate in the conversation. And if not, if you can't stay online for technological or time reasons, maybe you could ask me some questions right now as well.
I have time for 2.
Time for 2 questions, or you have time for both?
I have time for 2 questions.
Okay. Now, thank you so much. Anybody got a question?
I'm quite interested in terms of the kind of communities that you're working with or building, and I suppose who you're really working with. Are there people that are physically coming into these buildings to inhabit them? Are they people that already lived in the area? How are you kind of displacing or forming or working with particular communities?
Right on. That's a great question. And it's great because you said both working with and building, creating, that both of those things are happening simultaneously. In my neighborhood, there were, let's say, if there were 100 buildings, at one point 20 of them were unoccupied. And so we only worked with the housing stock that was abandoned. And that housing stock was a beautiful and rich housing stock, but there's been no displacement, so to speak. But what's been interesting is that when people see us working on the buildings and they know that we worked on several, they'll walk by and they'll say, hey, is there an apartment for rent? And we say, yeah, there's an apartment for rent, or no, this is not an apartment. And we've been able to meet some new friends and neighbors, and then we're finding that, there are young people, young like me, who are looking for a spot on the south side, and they want to be on the block because they know we're on the block, which is awesome. But then there are situations like we just bought a building. It was a 6-unit building and it had 4 tenants. The building was in horrible condition, and we had to immediately provide heat because it's very cold in Chicago right now. And so when we bought the building and told our neighbors that their rent was going to drop, we were going to add immediate heat and do some restoration, fix the kitchens and stuff, they were super excited, because I really wanted to just help stabilize the folks who were already living there. Now, it's also reasonable that, where I live, I feel like this is as much my neighborhood as it is anybody else's. So there's a certain amount of agency that I have where, I don't feel like I have to ask anybody for permission. I think the beauty of being embedded in a neighborhood and being part of a place for a very long time is that my neighbors and I believe in the same things. Like, we don't want people selling drugs on the block. We don't want gangbangers disturbing and creating violence when it's unnecessary. We don't want our children to get caught in the crossfire of craziness. And so we try to self-organize and do things to create opportunities so that those things don't happen. And that's a learning process, and it's a negotiation, and we can't do it by ourselves. And we're one part of a very large network of people who believe in where they live and are trying to do really amazing things.
You have another question for somebody? Okay, I got one last one. We're in the Room of Controversy, and which is a room where we're just exactly trying to think about what Tanya says is 21st century practices but housed in the 20th century museum. So that's all about artists and authorship on one level. So how do you think about that idea of your authorship as Theaster Gates and the kind of communal practice? Is there a tension? Is there a way in which this is resolved? Is there a way in which you talk about this?
Right. So when you use words like 20th century and 21st, I think about modernism and postmodernism. I think that there's at least 20 ways of talking about any one project that any of us are engaged in. And that there are different perspectives on it, and that all of those perspectives are really important. And so there are times when I'm talking to a museum, and it's really important for me to acknowledge not only myself as a worker and a labor, but also my studio team and my neighbors. And then there are times when I'm attempting to share my vision and philosophy on an idea. All that matters is my vision and philosophy. I really want to understand when to use what narrative, because there is no one dominant narrative. And I think that that's been the problem of the contemporary art world and the museum, is that it only has room for one person at a time. And it wants to believe that activism has a certain kind of thing. And well, I couldn't do what I do without other people.
Now, beautifully put. I think you're right. It's as much the problem of the insistence on our part of authorship and our inability to kind of think about a more broad and complex, simply collaboration sometimes. Thank you, Theaster, really.
Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you guys so much.
I hope we get to talk again soon. Thanks a lot. You see the part of the Arte Skype.
Your hands in hands.
Yes.
That's good.
which art really does what it pretends, or says, or suggests that it's all real. And so we are in a museum, and there are quite a few these days that are quite dominant in the art discourse. We are in a museum that deals with art as a critical society. So there's one of the few cases from which one can look at society. So critical art, that's great. I love to read. That's great. But I think if we all acknowledge, I think we should find out that the real effect on society is not created by this critique. And it's not even created at the level of the museum or the curator. Of course, at some point, artists, many, I think those pretty much anybody here, decided that they themselves should become not the artists who can then be curated by curators, but that they should become curators. And I think by now, probably Theaster has thought that maybe it's better to become a real estate investor. Because that's really on the level at which art becomes operational. And so I think it's not enough to think, okay, my art just needs to be critical, and it's all it does, and that's how it's going to alter or really question society. If the real questions aren't in real society, are not managed by artists. We know that critical art is used in many ways and has come up to make cities more attractive, to brand them, and that's why it's fun. That's why Istanbul made it sometimes short, that's why it's not powerful, etc., etc. So I don't think it's good enough for an artist to speak to the position, well, I just within my work, whatever that may be, want to offer this critical perspective of society, and then allow for real effects, a real impact of such works to be managed, not only by curators, not only by real estate investors, but by the people scheming these things. Okay, let's say these are very often the very people that we may be critical of in our work, or the very policies that we are critical of in our work, are at the same time funded or created by people who indirectly fund us. The vanabbemuseum would not be possible without the Dutch government. The Dutch government would not be possible without a Dutch union. And we know these things, and it's fine. So I think it's not enough, or maybe it's not fine, but anyway, what is certain is it's not enough for an artist to just produce critical work and then show it in a few museums. And I think we can agree on that. Not only is it useless, not only is it maybe immoral sometimes, but it's especially not taking responsibility for what art is and can be doing. If you think that the canvas that you want to operate on is indeed a canvas that you can suffice with paint and brushes. If you think that maybe the real game is played in the museum, then you can suffice with 1970s institutional critique. Take out the windows or put some lights there. That's great. If you think that's the level of which you should. If you think art has a real position in the world and artistic strategies can really work in the world, then obviously then you should not try to work at the level of a curator, you can do it like it, but then you should try and work on the level of, as Theaster organized, a real estate investor. So all of that in mind, I thought, again, it's my responsibility to deal with kind of interesting again with the panels, it becomes in and of itself a type of institutional critique to activate these subjects in a place where they don't seem to matter. These sorry, malnourished plantation workers aren't interested in art. Well, maybe they're not. Maybe they are. They're certainly interested in capital accumulation. And I think they're also interested in art, or in the way I frame it anyway, so they learn that they subsidize this economic interaction. I think they would be quite interested in that. So we're just trying to bridge these worlds and make them really productive. Again, both for what happens locally, accumulating capital, but also bringing these very complex and difficult questions. What's our mandate? To put it in a place where we can really and brutally honest way to think about it, surrounded by subsidizing something. It would be very interesting, or it would not be, it is very interesting to learn from these plantation workers again, the discussion. And so these are the discussions. This was one example of it, our opening seminar. We built like a temporary settlement out of that movie, painted in white. It was very, very much into this setting. And we invited a number of people to talk about institutional critique and its history. We had Florida, who certainly, whether we like him or not, is not a question. He is used, his theory is used by the institution and by any that we are very happy to participate in. So it is, again, my responsibility to do. So maybe we can show, this is an interesting place on that plantation. It's a former Unilever commodity store. Up to 15 years ago, they would sell like fish hooks or maybe like palm oil to where they were living, almonds. So in these shops to their workers. But wages have dropped so tremendously. A few years ago, they were like $5 a month or something. Now they're up into $20 a month. That's a great improvement, but still, the shops have no use for that, which is bad. So, in the framework of our, attempt to accumulate capital through the production of critical art, we kind of cleaned up this place, painted it white, and had all kinds of creative sessions. And we were planning indeed a collaboration with the vanabbemuseum in that very building. So we had some video pieces that we showed just half a year ago. Video pieces by what I think is a very, we all agree, is a very interesting period, this transition from minimalism, late 60s, early 70s, to institutional critique. So some video pieces made in that period. But funnily enough, new plantation owners, Canadian company, they bought it from me just a few years ago. They put guys with guns in front of it. We had rented it legally. We had all the right, official paperwork and that. But they put guys with guns in it, and we were no longer allowed to operate it. So even if the whole story I tell you is really remarkably pro-business, bringing in Florida to talk in an artist about things seems kind of silly, maybe, or I don't know what. But even that is controversial in much of the world. You can do it here, it's fine. But as soon as you bring it to places where capital accumulation is radical, then we're shut down as a little arts organization. These kids were all making drawings. We had some Israeli trauma therapists flying in to teach them how to get over all the accumulation of suffering over the last century. People who only deal with terrorist attacks, earthquakes, tsunamis. But all the drawings were then later confiscated publicly. And so far we haven't had that. This is some of these workshops that we did. And this is another image of it.
project, and there's so many questions sure come up. I mean, my first question is quite basic. What's the status of things now? The relationship with the owners?
It's quite good. I mean, it was humiliating for everybody involved in some way, so they really wanted to release all that and force us into signing a contract and say that we would never come back again. That's what Canadian Parliament wanted. Force us to do that. So at some point we'll be able to renegotiate. I don't think they're bad people. That's how all companies can operate. This is just how it works.
What was their, just to understand, what was their issue?
Well,
It was theirs and they didn't want you to interfere?
I mean, it's not there. They rent to land, obviously, their workers out and are not formally owned by I don't think they want people to have alternatives, think about anything other than just trying to get through the day. I mean, that's a really fantastic position to be in. And even if you know that everyone is trying to raise wages at some point, why not? I think it's only tiny little pockets like these, not only this museum, but also a country like this. And if you understand the world, one can ask these questions at all. And so as soon as you export questions, usually answer the questions, they do become controversial. So I think it's the statement that art has been co-opted by capital, that's wishful thinking more often than not. We really want to be co-opted by this. Because if you just go outside, a tiny bit outside of the confined zones, and like Cuba and this variations, then it becomes one of the radical. Now, again, the funny thing is we're not using the radical language of anything. We're pro business. We want to accumulate capital through creativity, which is the biggest driver of the economy.
How would you actually accumulate capital? That's the case. It's very clear here as well. But if we sort of went into kind of fast forward, hyped up gentrification process in the research centre turned into a wonderful contemporary art space, and biennial, for example, and brought with it huge investment in terms of property and institutions. Presumably these workers would be forced out. If we go back to this original understanding of gentrification, they would be displaced. And how do you...
Well, I think so far I'm a little bit reluctant to even discuss it for two reasons. First of all, people live in mud huts. I'm not sure you're going to want their mud huts to live. Child center floors and other reasons. So that's the first thing. The people that live on these plantations have no property rights whatsoever. The minute the plantation tells them they're out, they're sick, they're forced on the plantation the next day. They're sick for 3 months, they're forced on. So, you know, that's terrible, obviously, but the status quo is such that that's just it. The other thing, the other thing why I'm reluctant to really discuss it is that I just try to deal with the reality the way it is. Certainly, we are all against all populations being forced out of areas like Lower East Side, and yet we all, I mean, once we get invited to the spaces anyway, want good enough just to critique or critical analysis of reality and stop there. I think the critical analysis and critique will be much stronger if we incorporate the very systemic structures that allow us to operate. And the systemic structure here is that people think it's cool to have a research institution rather than in the long run, one way we have to human capital. That should be part of our self-understanding so that we can deal with it. That's why I'm not interested in the imaginary property, because it kind of negates much of the reason why we can exist in the real world. And so I'm inherent to a long tradition in the arts. Must first and foremost come to terms with the suspending of the past, whether that is
So we would like to ask WochenKlausur to tell something, or even just react or present.
Tell something.
Tell something. That's a good.
Visualization. The last one.
We are always invited by cultural and arts institutions to do the project, and I think seeing this session in this light and how we work within this context and what these art institutions are trying to utilize each time that we are invited into the institution. And I think Justifying Neighborhood in Cologne, it's where the Center for Digital Art is currently sitting. We just moved there a few months ago, but they were started already 12 years ago, 13 years ago, something like that. And they have been working very extensively in the Justifying Neighborhood. It's really, I think, in the Tel Aviv metropolitan, one of the most, underdeveloped, very big project, and a lot of immigrants from Russia and Ethiopia. And so we were invited there, and what we did there is a home improvement project that basically many of the houses, as you see here, belong to a social housing company called Amidal. And these social housing, so they're giving for like a very, very cheap rent, but for years these houses haven't been renovated, and every time they call up the company and say like, hey, I have a leaking bathroom or whatever, all the electricity cords, everything is out, there's danger, they just transfer you to the next clerk and the next week. And basically the idea of the project here was to set up a structure that could both get workers, so here, you just see like two examples of houses and a worker. But basically getting both donations for materials from different companies within Cologne, and also getting professionals, carpenters and
construction workers to do these improvements in the houses. And basically this was set up within the digital art center, and it's almost 2 years already. Yeah? It is still operating, and especially now when they moved into the neighborhood. I think they opened just a few months ago. They opened an office, especially for this initiative, and people can come into the office, basically apply with their house to get it renovated, and then there will be someone that would survey the property and see what has been done, and according to that, either with the equipment they have and labor that was already, people donating their own labor would go and do it, or then would go and get needed materials and people to do the construction. So,
I think we were thinking that in this discussion it's also very important to speak about failure, and it's also not that all of our, many of our, almost every there was one project which was adapted to failure. And it's also interesting because it's like always working actually on invitation to cultural or art institutions. I'd say we're always working on invitation, and in this case, we reply to an invitation coming from artists. Not as we do in all our projects, we build up an on-site office. In this case, in an area, it was in Leeds, in the UK, I have to say that, in 2006. And we built up an office in just redeveloped area very close to the city center, which enabled this whole network innovation. And the architects asked us to start a project No, because they, I think they're completely dependent. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm speaking now about them.
No, it's fine. I don't know. We don't know yet.
Yeah.
So, but one of the really interesting things for me about your project is WochenKlausur is adopted a lot more constantly, because it's one of the few projects actually, in terms of the overall history, and actually implements a sustainable pattern. Like, it's very extraordinary to see what most of the time, one could enunciate exactly what you said. There's a situation, there's a thing, it works, it doesn't, engage, or they don't, and it goes for a certain period, and then it doesn't. Whatever, exactly the 40s, that we wipe out quietly goes away. What seems to be really interesting about the practice that you do is that it actually often figures out its own practice. Kind of thinking
Actually, you say that you use the argument as a vehicle way to do this, and maybe also as regular reasons for initiatives. So, for example, the example I go on, who are these people that go on fixing up these houses, and why do they do it?
So I mean, I think this is part of it's like always structuring the mechanism with all this kind of, and I think not, I mean, many of the projects might stop at, I mean not many, but some of the projects will stop after a year or 2 years or 3 years when they're not needed anymore. Yeah, when they come to terms with the challenge or the issue that they're trying to address. But like I think with Holland, and I think Holland is a very good example of the people there. I mean, first of all, the people in the community that is really in it, and I think this is a place that is begging for gentrification and it's begging for development, clearly, and I think it's, and on the other hand, I think there's the center of the art that is very, very engaged and is working on multiple levels, to ensure that this kind of work is happening. So then, of course, when people are being addressed and approached or addressed, that doesn't come out of the work in this context. The first artist that doesn't come in there to the work is definitely also not that.
Is it like an intern system, a free intern system in galleries, and now also fixing up houses?
Who did it in class? Yeah, so there is a person, I mean, what was one of the things that we got is someone that isn't paid. I mean, when we finished the project, he was in part-time, working, paid to coordinate the project. So I think in that that sense, also one of our tasks is if there is, we know it won't happen in goodwill because projects don't happen only in goodwill. Yeah. So of course, it is like part of the thing will always be finding the money to hold someone or a few people as needed by, with a salary.
Yeah, that's always what I found so interesting. And we were trying to, one of the big challenges in Arte Útil was always the idea that the gesture is great, the awareness is great, the moment during the exhibition or as long as an art institution is interested in it is great. How does it sustain? And
Usually arguments are difficult to use for example.
yeah. And what I always liked about the idea of the project was that you more about the sustainability.
Yeah, that's really important. I mean, not all the projects have been sustainable, but I mean, our main focus is usually to create knowledge. So in this case, we thought a lot of energy has to go into this idea also to create or to establish, the project. Who keeps track of, people who already agreed to donate their time, but might also have to find new ones in case there is now material in it that's not there, and it is coordinated to go to the owner. And so it's ways to
So when you are invited by some institution, I know or you're maybe at the Hamburg or else, do you negotiate, say, well, okay, we will come to 3 weeks, we'll do some workshops, whatever it is. Start of the project, but then for 2 years, you need to pay this coordinator that will make sure that it keeps on going. How are we?
I mean, usually it's not as it is coordinated or the structure we put in place. Usually, but never really actually as it is, but it wasn't.
So when you say that you
Usually not. Really, it depends on the project. Sometimes we really run into applications or to organizations who then give you money that this person can stay. Sometimes in another project we do a raffle or we ask for donations for prices and put them in surprise rates and the visitors of the exhibition could purchase them.
that's not structurally sustainable. That's like long-term for a year or something.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know.
But always the initial indication, for example, for us here, would be a few weeks where you will pay to develop the concept, and then part of implementing the concept would be to find financial statement.
Yeah, but maybe as you said, usually we try to establish something and then can continue. That's an initiation. And so if you say that the case when it was not sustainable, but
I'm not trying to ask it as a kind of like this, but one of the things I found so interesting was that you always thought about it. You always thought about it. I understood that actually some projects really do that. Yes, there's so much.
Example, also in the sense that's the first project, setting up a mobile medical clinic for homeless people in Vienna. And correct me if I'm wrong, but then after that it was set up and got the money for the first few months, it was basically taken over by the city government because the city government saw the necessity of such a thing and then it operates until basically. So I think it's also how do you negotiate this kind of necessities into the space that people then can overtake what you have started.
I think that's also fundamentally that, I don't know what your background is, but maybe it goes beyond their skills as artists to kind of create this.
I'm not good at economics, right? I don't think it's about that. I mean, I think it's you're selling something at the end of the day, right? You're persuading people that this is like important and worthwhile to have half an hour to listen to you and then in the end to take part in it.
Also, you're just a citizen, you know, I mean, as an artist, you're not as incapable or more capable than any other citizen to negotiate your space in society and what you might need, or what you might fight for, or what you might campaign for. And there's no sort of sense of romance and sort of monologue about what you kind of achieved that you should just have because you're an artist.
No, I don't think, but I think still, like what does work, and I'm thinking out it's like really stupid, but like when you come into offices and you say like, oh, I'm an artist and I'm doing this thing, I mean, many times I'm encountered that people are willing to listen. And I think more than,
Well, that's true. Like most people think creative people are extremely chaotic for people. It's a stereotype.
The thing is that this Kickstarter, which has a sort of financial base, can generate social sustainability action. Meaning, it is a lot of investment also. I mean, how much control do you have over it? It is something that can focus on the social sustainability, and then you get to the hard situation. You like, why are these people doing this? They don't get anything out of it. Even if it's already a sole project that just keep going with it.
And I almost say, because you're just an artist and ally, and art is a brilliant ally, and I think you're trying to acknowledge and challenge the idea of what is the capacity of art, and not only that, someone will take responsibility, and there's a time where the elasticity of it allows us to, you know, where's the elasticity of it pay back, you know, where does it actually take responsibility for that? So, yeah, I mean, I think it's exactly that. Which is why we have the institution repurpose, it's like, these are things that are the strategies are to actually start to allow you to think differently, because they give you different challenge and narratives. But the other point is it's really horrible to romanticize this shit.
yeah, I mean,
I just wanted to add something to the point how do we find the people. It's interesting because I think it's a little bit about the research. So if we find the right people, and the interesting thing is that we kind of, in most cases, really do, because there are always people who are motivated to do something, but actually like the context or maybe also the platform. But there are always people who really want to do something, and it's not only for the cost of money.
but I must say that this is like very depending on the context we're working in, because I think in the European context, and like in cities like Eindhoven, yes, but like in the city like Rotterdam, also like I mean, I know the background there, like a bit like in Israel, part of like poverty has a lot to do with this, with the unity of the nation in this, yeah, and it's like becomes your trapped in the way this is like one of the ways that like also this can be very easily criticized in the way that you become part of this trap, that you're generating more and more donations and more and like these small fixing which are definitely needed and not like disregarding the fact that if we would, I mean, like through this project, this woman wouldn't get her house fixed probably in any other way, yes, but at the same time, how do we break out of the cycle of just begging constantly for more and more and not like working in a larger frame?
Also, a really crucial question on that, I think, which is interesting, is what does it mean to exactly invitation? You know, who's asking me, why am I being asked, to whom am I speaking? That's distinct from deciding who to speak. Not that the other one is better necessarily, actually, no, I don't even know how to do exactly what I'm saying. But the notion of invitation is really kind of interesting.
It's probably prediction in doing it. I spoke with the executive. I think she found a movement in the institution. She's very aware that on the one hand, she, you know, this institution has been justify an ideological position, which is not just about Israel, it's just what happened, by factoring the little exceptions to it. The world is kind of dominated by big money streams, and then people such as you and I and many others here, and then create little exceptions to, by doing things for free. And so that's fine, maybe that is great. But does it offer a real model to engage with the world, or is it just the same as making flowers, making these nice beautiful things, making them beautiful women and something? Little exceptions to dominance, reality. That's something I really try to think about sometimes.
I mean, for me, yeah, what you were saying before, like,
in general, like there's two ways to go about it. I mean, you can go in the system and see what practice there is, or you can make something parallel to it. Yeah, Toys R Us. You know, of course you're going to use a different language. So aesthetic, and you can also use this kind of designer or artist, your aesthetic to, you know, gentrify things. But you always have to think about how people react to this aesthetic. Like if you look at the design research field, for example, when you're doing a workshop or something, and you make something that looks very pretty, often people kind of react to, oh, this is cool, but on the other hand, you shouldn't make it too pretty that people are afraid to write on it. So aesthetic, I don't know, for me it's a very functional element. It's definitely something to do. And that's also
I completely agree with this. I think also we use maybe also aesthetical or aesthetic as an instrument to achieve certain things. For example, the creation of our office. We want to create a space where we feel good.
And that's an area. That's an object. It's temporary.
Yeah, that definitely does not really consider that it's our art.
Maybe we need to open up the idea of what the national good is.
We go back to the invitation thing, because Renzo, is you
which of course has the past and all, it's very interesting and difficult to but you know, it's a classic moment of avant-garde, you know, this idea that we sort of get intercepts of our breaking through, we're doing whatever. And is this critique actually, as distinct from the productivity of what's going on in art there, not just perpetuating art and actually and I know the market is perpetuating that, but I'm just wondering if critique level of the art world isn't something that perpetuates around the markets and the companies develop.
I think if we look at that critique, just producing stuff for
break something rather than a kind of much more layer of what it's
I'm also sort of struggling with the issue of monolism itself, because basically we are sort of treating it as if it's something like a standalone monolith that has ended at a certain point. And I'm sort of wondering, if we can really talk about this intrinsic thing out of the thing, in the thing is alienated real life society, and out of the thing we confronting totally, in reality, protecting issues that are coming from the thing after, which is real. And I'm sort of wondering, actually, I'm convinced that monolism is, as far as I'm concerned, somewhere never really stopped or sort of changed into something that it actually not always was part of us. Because I think that the whole idea of art is universe, art and itself, I think, you said something about that art was always, let's say, in the service of some power but I think also in the time of monolism, it was in the service of the power.
We went to the drawings very easily.
challenging. No, I mean,
Yeah, so you just hit it once again.
yeah.
I want to say that's definitely more than I want to say it very quickly because I don't want that anyone who visits now goes in this room and sees this celebrating and just wants to give people an idea of what's possible, what we need, and it's open source. If someone has that opportunity, that's running an exhibition has almost no art. In different positions, yes, but sometimes there are different situations that I just don't know what to do.
Yeah, and as we has to be pushed forward and much further, and there has to be found like new ways how this thing has to be exhibited, because this is like saying like this is now an exhibit, like one of the only exhibitions in the Abend that there's like no artwork, no matter what. I mean, it's still using very similar mediums, even if it's not artwork.
It's the ultimate collapse, it's the ultimate tension. It's like the music project we did at Room